Welcome, everybody, to the University of St. Thomas, to the Center for International Studies, and to the Distinguished Diplomat Program, all elements of the university. And we want to say a special hello to our collaboration organization today, the Foreign Policy Association. We've done one lunch with them previously. We thought we would expand it into a town hall. University of St. Thomas, as you know, is trying to build students of faith and character. And in the Center for International Studies, we're interested in people expanding their view of international studies, and we focus a lot on international development, help all boats float a little higher. And the Distinguished Diplomat Program, of which I am the coordinator, I'm Richard Sindelar, the coordinator of that program. My goal there is to inspire and educate students toward careers in diplomacy on a wide basis. Not only the U.S. State Department, but other government agencies involved in international affairs such as Treasury, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, etc. I also try to inspire students to be involved in diplomacy, the outreach of what you might call social diplomacy, or the helping hand people to people that are done through non-governmental organizations such as the Doctors Without Borders organization, who was just very recently on campus talking about their program. So non-governmental organizations are a diplomatic cultural outreach to the rest of the world. And finally, here in Houston, with all our multinationals, we have diplomacy in all those companies, government relations departments. If you're going to do a deal in any country, you're going to need diplomatic awareness to accomplish it with the government of whichever country. So that's kind of where the University of St. Thomas comes from. I want to take just a moment tonight, those of you who arrived early enough to see the rolling PowerPoint. The Distinguished Diplomat Program started 5 years ago with one endowed lecture. We've now done 3 endowed lectures, working on our 4th one for next spring, and we've run over 75 different programs. And one of those programs that we've expanded into with the help of supporters, those who financially support us, is to have program fellows. Our first program fellow was Yasmin Saker, who helped us develop our social media platform. Still needs more work, but it's a lot more robust than it was before. And she worked on Nile water issues for us, did a lot of research on that. We now have a second program fellow, Ian Houston, formerly the executive director of our partner organization, the American Foreign Service Association in Washington. He's now gone out on his own to develop his own company, Clyde Built International, which focuses on helping people like this university gain more funding, gain more traction, gain more visibility. He's using a lot of his skills from his days in the diplomatic service and with AFSA. And I'd like Ian to just stand up just for a minute so you can see Ian. And Ian will be working on a project for us. We're going to try to put some numbers to what diplomacy means. How many tax dollars are actually spent for the U.S. Foreign Service and diplomatic issues for the State Department? How much does that cost you, and what benefit do you get? His working title is Diplomatic Capacity. How much capacity do we have to do diplomacy, and diversity? What can we bring to it from various resources? So we're going to be working on that. And this is not an issue that's been studied heavily, so we think we might break some new ground. One thing Ian said, I'll probably misquote him, for instance, your entire diplomatic service around the world, all embassies, State Department, U.S. aid operations, etc., the entire expenditure for a year is about the similar expenditure for about one carrier battle group. One carrier battle group. Now, that includes the cruisers and the personnel, but the personnel and the expenditures are about one carrier battle group. If you want to expand it, maybe a carrier and a half, but but that's all you're spending for the diplomacy that keeps you at peace. So with that, let me introduce Eric Botts, who is a board member of the Foreign Policy Association, and he'll welcome you and talk a bit more about the Foreign Policy Association and the commonality they're trying to find for us. Eric?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to acknowledge University President Dr. Richard Ludwig and Dr. Hans Stockton, Director of the Center for International Studies, for their support for tonight's program, and to offer special thanks to Professor Richard Sindelar for his leadership in coordinating the Distinguished Diplomat Program. Welcome, university students, staff, and honored guests. My name is Eric Botts, Adjunct Professor for International Studies and a former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service Officer, Passport Services Assistant Director, and Information Systems Security Officer. I'm also a board member for the Foreign Policy Alliance, so I'm wearing the two hats today. This program this evening is a collaboration between the Foreign Policy Alliance and the University of St. Thomas Center for International Studies Distinguished Diplomat Program. The Foreign Policy Alliance is a left-right convergence with participants that come from Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, and Green parties, as well as citizen activists. Information about the Foreign Policy Alliance is available just outside the door in the table when you first come in, and I encourage you to go ahead and look at the resolution that the Foreign Policy Alliance has crafted and some of our other documents, and sign up if you can for our website. Fundamentally, this program is about bringing together people with differing viewpoints into a serious discussion about the foreign policy challenges facing the nation today, and to encourage a frank and open exchange of views. The views expressed tonight by our panelists and others do not reflect the views of the University of St. Thomas or the Foreign Policy Alliance, but are offered to further the debate and advance the dialogue about foreign policy issues that face our country. We are fortunate tonight in that our moderator for tonight's program is multiple Emmy award-winning journalist Patricia Gras. In addition to multiple Emmy awards, she has received 170 broadcasting awards. Ms. Gras is also an accomplished singer-songwriter, author, and producer. Patricia Gras began her career in Spain after graduating from the Thunderbird School of Global Management and the Escola Superior de Administración de Directo de Empresas in Barcelona in a dual master's program. After receiving another master's degree, this one in journalism from Columbia University in New York, Ms. Gras has worked for Telemundo and PBS, our local PBS station here. Since 2012, she has had her own award-winning production company called Love Smart Living Media. She's traveled extensively, visiting over 62 countries, and she speaks 5 languages. Will you please join me in offering a very warm welcome for Ms. Patricia Gras.
Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce the panelists, the distinguished panelists. And what, you can't hear me? Oh no, technical difficulties. There you go. I'm going to introduce the panelists. Then we'll have 20 minutes of questions that I'll be asking them. Then 20 minutes, you will be getting cards, index cards, to write your questions. Try not to make the same questions. And then 15 minutes where you come up to the microphone and ask your questions. So let me introduce the distinguished panel. Richard Sindelar. Like I said, technical difficulties. I can maybe do it without the mic, but anyway. Richard Sindelar is an assistant professor with courses focusing on American foreign policy, international security, international law, and global trade. Sindelar received his law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center and served more than 22 years as a diplomatic officer in the U.S. Department of State Foreign Service. Also, Sindelar has periodically appeared on TV, radio, on international news on Channel 26, Fox News, Channel 11, 13, 2, KTRK-H Radio, and he can speak on various Middle East political and security topics. He told me not to put him on the spot, but I will. Ambassador Christopher Cox Ashby served as the United States ambassador to Uruguay under Bill Clinton and George Bush from 1997 to 2001. Ashby was born in Dallas, Texas. He graduated from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in 1968 and received an MBA from the University of Texas Graduate School of Business in 1970. At Georgetown, he was Bill Clinton's roommate. Stories to tell there. He also attended the MIT Sloan School of Management and Harvard Business School. He spent 4 years in the Marine Corps and served in Vietnam. He worked in international banking, most notably the Chemical Bank and Chase Manhattan Bank. He has also worked for the United Nations. He's a member of the advisory board of the Small Business Administration and a Foreign Policy Association of New York. Mr. Allan Vogel, he is a Foreign Policy Alliance board member. He has a varied career, which has run a gamut from paperboy to traveling museum attendant to journalism to longshore clerk to the printing industry to entrepreneur and small businessman. He has been active in many political campaigns as a petitioner, organizer, manager, and as a candidate in a nonpartisan as well as partisan elections with the Libertarian Party. His interest in foreign policy dates to the Vietnam War and has led him to a multi-partisan foreign policy alliance as the best opportunity for long overdue reform. Joseph Marcinkowski is a founding member of the Foreign Policy Alliance as well, who brought the idea of left-right alliance on foreign policy, inspired by Ralph Nader on his 2014 book, Unstoppable, to the planning group that organized the 2015 Houston Peace and Justice Center Conference, Peace or Wars Without End. He earned a BA in Economics and History from City College, New York, CUNY, served in the U.S. Army, and worked in the fossil fuel industry for over 26 years, mostly outside of the United States. As an activist, he is a Houston representative of the School of the Americas Watch, SOAW, and executive committee member of the Houston Peace and Justice Center, as well as a member of Pax Christi and Veterans for Peace. Welcome to all of you. And thank you. And of course, we have to start with the news today. And of course, we're hearing almost every day the last week about China. Are we opening up a trade war with China and Mexico? And is this good or bad for America? Let's start with Professor Richardson.
Is a trade war good or bad for America? Obviously bad. It's going to cost us, first of all, for all of you here, the prices of what you are going to buy are going up in one way or another. If it's made with steel, it'll go up. If it's made with aluminum, it'll go up. The Beer Association is already fighting the tariffs on aluminum because they need that to can your Bud Light for you, and so your Bud Light's going to go up. Ultimately, it's hard to calculate, but the point of the matter is we will probably see inflationary pressures. We've had a very steady economy for many, many years now, except for the 2008 dive, but we've never had our rampant stagflation of the 70s and 80s. That's coming back.
Anybody else want to comment on this question?
Pardon me. I think it's too soon to tell. The purpose of this is to reduce, at least, the extraordinary level of intellectual property that is being stolen by the Chinese. If it works, then it's a good idea. So far, because of the size of the Chinese market, American companies have been willing to sort of pay any price, including giving up their technology and their patents. That is, in the long run, far more costly than a trade war. None of these tariffs go into effect for another 6 months, and it's my hope that in that time they will come to an arrangement that would reduce the level of intellectual property thievery.
Gentlemen, do you want to add to that?
The trade war sounds like it's getting much closer to a Cold War. And Mathis said a couple of weeks ago that China and Russia are our enemies, and we're going to have to prepare for this by funding a more broader military, even broader than this last one that picked up $80 billion. And may have to attack your Social Security and Medicare, he said. And I find that pretty upsetting. You know, if you think these young people at Parkland were polished and when they came out and spoke to everybody, I think the Great Panthers will be twice as polished when they come out and see their Social Security and Medicare going away.
I'm not in favor of any kind of war, and that would include a trade war, so I think it's definitely a bad idea.
Okay, another news subject today was Mexico and the National Guard and our border. Is this something that is necessary? Is it good for America, or it's a bad idea? Would you like to take that?
It's always been a bad idea. We got along with Mexico for so many years without walls, without the Homeland Security Department that's breaking our budget. It would be much better if we could work this out the way we did it 30, 40 years ago.
Which was?
People can cross the border. When they're finished working here, they go back over on the other side. We have to stop treating Mexico, Central America as our backyard, and we create the problems down here that force the people here. You know, we're talking about Guatemala, Honduras. We take out the elected president and we put in a dictator. This all comes back at us. It's blowback.
I agree with Joe. We don't need a border wall between our two countries. We can get along, and that's what we should be doing.
Ambassador Ashby.
Well, it's a bad idea, but it's only one of a long series of bad ideas.
Can you be more specific?
I'm just talking about immigration. Clearly, there are some issues that are more valuable as political issues if they're unsolved than if they're solved. And I think this is one of them.
Well, I served as Deputy Consul General in Monterey, and this was a big issue even back in those days, the crossing of the border. I always start any conversation about the wall by remembering a cartoon I saw. And in the background is a 20-foot wall. It had a big sign that says 20-foot wall coming to you courtesy of U.S. taxes or something like that. And in front of it is this little Mexican tienda, Jose's Tienda, ladders 21 feet. No wall. Ask the Chinese. Their wall never stopped any horde. Ask the French about the Maginot Line. Ask the Israelis how much terrorism they really stopped with their wall. Walls do not work. And importantly, if we put a wall in place, all they're going to do, if they can't go over it or under it, they're going to go around it. We will now have a Gulf of Mexico flotilla coming, just like the Mariel boat lift. So it's a total failure. The second thing I'd like to say is about deploying the military. We did a little bit of that with some Marines a few years ago, and we got a shepherd boy killed in the process because he looked too Mexican for the Marines involved in it. But the other thing is we have a law called the Posse Comitatus law that says you can't use the military for police action. Right. So they can sit there, basically they can sit there, and I presume they're the welcome, they're kind of like the Walmart welcome guy. Welcome, come on through, because they cannot make an arrest. They cannot make an arrest. And there's all sorts of technology that we used when I was in the Sinai Desert. You can track people by their very steps. Spend some money deploying high-tech technology rather than putting up bricks.
So it's a symbolic move to send the National Guard, really?
It's certainly not an American symbolic move. It's got nothing to do with American values, as these other fellows have said at all. It's basically geared toward who I call the Bud Pounders of Michigan, the guys pounding Bud Lights in the Dewdrop Inn who are bound and determined to get that same job back, turning the third lug nut on the back rear tire of the Chevy coming off the line, and those union jobs are not here anymore ever, and these guys don't want to be trained. So they sit there and they pound buds and they elect guys called Trump, and that's not American values.
Let's talk about Russia, also making the news. Relations between the U.S. and Russia appear to be strained to the breaking point with the tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats and the imposition of sanctions in the wake of a chemical agent and the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in the UK. Are these measures appropriate, and should more be done, or is this an overreaction?
Absolute overreaction, and I think it's planned, though. I think it's planned so that we can continue a Cold War and spend more money than we have already allocated to this Cold War. The poisoning is falling apart on them every minute. The daughter is better now. The police officer that was poisoned is better now. And there is absolutely no proof that the Russians were involved in this. The poison was made in Russia originally, but the OPCW, the organization that controls chemical weapons, was there when all chemical weapons in Russia were destroyed. There's a book out on how to do this. The chemist who does it lives in Princeton, New Jersey. He came over from Russia, and I don't understand how the British think they're going to get away with keep saying that it's doing without offering any proof or any evidence of what they're doing.
Well, I'd like to see some proof too. We believe in due process, and in this case, it looks like we're leaping to a judgment based on media reports. I'd like a little more evidence before we proceed.
Any evidence?
Well, I think we have evidence that they invaded the Crimea. We have evidence that they sent troops into Ukraine. We have evidence that they're supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. I think we, a while back, made a strategic error in thinking that we could bring Russia into the Western fold. That's against their history, it's against their values, and it's not working. I don't know the specifics of the nerve agent case any more than what I've read in the paper. I would have to say that it fits with other actions that they've undertaken. There are a lot of people who do not understand the reaction of the United States, and I am one of them. But it's another area in which American leadership is being questioned especially by the Europeans, who are taking things into their own hands. I will say this, they believe that the Russians were behind this.
I think when it comes to the Russian situation, generally I'll talk specifically about the chemical situation. We will probably never have the evidence that would be revealed in a U.S. court of law in due process, because I spent 3 different tours of duty in the State Department as an intelligence analyst, and I'm pretty confident by what is being said in the media and alluded to in the media that we have very, very, very strong evidence. Would we give that evidence to this panel and me? No. And the reason we wouldn't is we would reveal sources and methods. We would basically tell the Russians how we did it, and they would immediately shut down whatever intelligence angle we're using to gather it. The British apparently have 4 or 5 different pieces of intelligence to wrap around the fact that the chemical is one that is almost exclusively, there are apparently other countries that make some version of that chemical, but basically it's a Russian chemical. And the Russians, unfortunately, I'm loving it. I'm loving it because I served in the Cold War from 1973 to 1995, and that included Reagan and Gorbachev and Brezhnev and all the wonderful guys. And this is old home week, they kill somebody. Have we ever killed spies before? Yeah, back to Greek time or something. Sure. So we killed guys who were traitors, and then we throw each other's diplomats out for a while. The thing that's being missed by the media here, I think, is that apparently, and this is me guessing off of what's happening, but the fact that so many countries have joined in and who they are expelling, what they're really doing is tearing up some significant Russian intelligence network and making they're going to have to rebuild that, and that won't be done by next week. That's going to take them several years to rebuild their intelligence network. So Putin decided politically he needed to kill his traitor, and that's given us a welcome opportunity at a time when Putin seems to be acting more thuggish and invading people's elections to tear up his intelligence network. I kind of like it as an old Cold War.
Okay, and we have to stay with Russia because it did meddle in the U.S. presidential election of 2016 through cyber theft of private data, the placement of propaganda against particular candidates, and overall effort to undermine the public faith in the U.S. democratic process. Are we doing enough to stop future meddling of our elections?
Well, William Binney and Ray McGovern, who are veteran intelligence agents for sanity. William Binney was the first NAS IT manager. Ray McGovern gave briefings to George Bush Sr. and all that. Their view on this is that the Russians had nothing to do with any hacking of the information. The information was leaked and sent down. And they go through a very extensive IT description of why that's so. I tend to go with that view.
I would suggest that we need to put this issue in context. And that's really the only way we can deal with it in the long term. The context is basically what country interferes with the electoral processes of other countries the most. I could come up with a list of several dozen countries, at least, that the United States has interfered with, going back at least to the end of World War II. So we've constantly interfered with these countries, and that interference comes either interfering in an election, trying to promote one candidate or another, assassination plots, perhaps some assassinations. I think that there's no way that we can say to Russia or anybody else in the world that you should not be interfering in our elections as long as we continue to do that with other people. So I think ultimately what we have to do is say, it's not right for one country to interfere with the domestic affairs of another, and we're going to stop, and we want you to stop. And ultimately then, we're going to have to come up with a good defense because I don't necessarily think other countries will completely stop.
Ambassador?
I really would just repeat what I said earlier. This fits. This fits with what Russia is doing and has been doing. I don't know enough about the field to know what would be an appropriate technological response. But we are, I believe, ignoring again and again and again a series of actions which, when you put together, creates a hostile relationship. And yes, we have to be willing to do our part to alleviate that, but so do they.
I've never really fully understood whether or not they actually did any fiddling with the actual polling. And what most of what I've read is that no, they didn't. Yeah. What they did was propaganda. Yeah. And so that again goes back to the Greeks. It's the same thing.
It's been done before.
It's been done before. They obviously have figured out and are becoming the best in the world at leveraging the social media platforms for their own personal propaganda aims. I would get much more concerned at the point that we know that they are actually trying to change the count in the ballot box. And in that regard, I did read one article. that made mention of the fact that we have out there the technology. And I think most people know that each county throughout the United States makes its own deal with voting machine people, whoever's selling voting machines among the many companies that do. So each county has different systems, or each state has often different systems. But there is a system out there where everything can be recorded electronically, but the last thing you do is when you submit your ballot, a printed version of that goes out the back of the machine into a sealed container, or is placed in a sealed container, so that if something happens to the electronics, which is my concern that the Russians will find a way to hack in and change the numbers on the ballots, then you've got your written thing, you can do a recount. And that's the way I think you defeat it. And other than that, informational propaganda, we've been doing it, like this gentleman said, you know, everybody's been doing it since the Greeks.
Knowing what you know about Russia, though, this seems to be the new normal. It's not a good relationship right now.
Could you speak into your microphone, please?
It is not, sorry, it is not a good relationship right now with Russia. What could be done differently to perhaps create a better relationship if we are interested in something like that?
Well, as they say in Uruguay, it takes two to tango. I do not see at this point a willing receptor. Now, I could very well be wrong. I don't know the Russian players at all. It's very clear that domestically this is very popular. It's clear that at the end of the Soviet era, we did some things like moving NATO right up to their border, which they viewed as humiliating, and they still feel that sting. But those countries are not leaving NATO, and at this point, it's hard to see what we could do that would create a positive reception.
Sometimes I think we need to look at things from the other person's perspective, and perhaps the other country's perspective. You know, historically, Russia has had some significant problems that we haven't. They've been invaded multiple times over the years by Napoleon in the Second World War. They've had NATO around their country. They've had our missiles in Turkey. Remember how upset we got when the Soviets put missiles in Cuba? That was almost a war, we say. And perhaps we should consider that we're in a very unique situation in the United States where we have a big ocean on each side of us and a country to the north and to the south of us which are relatively friendly and militarily weak. And we seem to think that it's all right for us to go putting our bases and our missiles anywhere that we want. And I think we need to understand that other people might get upset about that and look at it from their perspective a bit if we're going to ever try to achieve some kind of a reasonable relationship.
Okay, let's move on to North Korea. Can President Trump succeed while others have failed? His meeting with dictator Kim Jong-un to negotiate the future of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Can Trump pull it off like a Nixon in China breakthrough with North Korea? And is defending South Korea from North Korea a waste of U.S. dollars, as Trump has said?
Yes, I'd say it's a waste of dollars. This is another example. In a sense, Korea is kind of China's Cuba, so to speak. They're right next to China. We have tremendous missiles there, which, of course, we say are only to be used in one context. But you can understand that perhaps the Chinese might feel differently. Can Trump pull off some kind of an arrangement with Kim Jong-un? I seriously doubt it, but I'd love to see that happen. It would be a tremendous coup. I think that once again, the best thing for us to do with the Koreas is to let them resolve the issue. And if you go back to the Geneva agreements where Korea was discussed back in the 50s, there were some resolutions that were made, but the U.S. wasn't too happy about the concept of withdrawing from Korea as the North wanted to do and allowing for elections there. In the long run, the Koreans are going to have to make that decision, and we need to leave it to them to do.
To your first question, might he be successful? Maybe. Certainly nothing else has been. I think the probability is low. But the question I would have is that if they have direct interaction and it fails, then what? What do we go back to, or how do we go forward? I don't think that's been very well thought out. I do not fault him for trying. I'm just very concerned that it's not very well prepared, and then there's, whenever you take a significant action like this, you have to ask yourself, and then what do you do?
If it doesn't work out.
And, or if it does. I don't see that having happened.
When it comes to North Korea, this is the one issue in the Trump administration where it seems to me to be very intriguing. I'm fascinated to see what might happen. I sometimes think of it the same way you posed it as Nixon's opening to China. Could there be some sort of breakthrough? Very intriguing to see what might happen. My concern, and why I doubt that anything will come of it at all, is that the administration is putting the wrong team on the field. It's like the Texans going up against the Patriots and deciding that you're going to have the roller derby people do your team. It's the wrong team. They really, I don't think, bring any skill set, any of them, including Trump himself, to the table that can make this work. I mean, Kim Jong-un has said some very intriguing things, including not once but twice in the last couple of months mentioning unification. What does he mean by that? Could it be some sort of federation where he gets economic value and maybe gives up his nuclear weapons because he's part of a South Korean confederation? He's mentioned this twice now. Nobody's talking about it, and that's because the team is the wrong team. So I think 6 months down the road, we'll be throwing tweet bombs at each other again.
I agree with a lot Professor Sindelar said there. I think Trump has enough of an ego that he would like to pull this off. I think President Moon in South Korea has vested a lot of his political capital in this, and they definitely see a way of getting together. At least he wants that to happen. He's got, as Professor Sindelar mentioned there, a bunch of crazies in there. Bolton, there's 3 or 4 of them that will destroy this deal if they're involved in it. But if he works with Xi in China alone, I think he could possibly do it, and his ego would want him to do it. It'd be a big prize in his spot there. So.
Well, and on that same note, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was fired and will be replaced by former UN Ambassador under the Bush administration, John Bolton. Bolton is hawkish on the Iran nuclear deal and North Korea. If President Trump and Ambassador Bolton decided to go to war with any of these 2 countries, how challenging would it be for Congress to approve such a move? And is this a possibility even?
What move again?
The possibility of going to war because they're very hawkish about Iran and North Korea.
Well, I certainly hope not. I think the balance there is the Europeans, because the Europeans think it's a good deal. The rest of the world pretty much thinks it's a good deal. We're the outliers. We're the Brexit people. We're throwing ourselves off to the side. And it may come back to haunt us in everything from banking to oil. Who knows? I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think the Iranians are truthful when they say they will give it up. That's number one. Number two, there is a fatwa out there saying it's bad to have nuclear weapons. Now, whether they really would or not, I don't know, but that carries clerical weight in Iran. And the sanctions are off, and they desperately need the extra revenue with the release of the sanctions. I think the Iranians will stick with it, and on top of it, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has a very robust inspection regime where they're following this, so I don't think you suddenly start enriching again. So without it becoming very obvious. So I don't know why in the world we want to go to war with well, I do know. Because Trump would be playing to his one best buddy, Sheldon Adelson. And Sheldon Adelson and Israel think that Iran is ultimately going to do in the Jewish state, and they're not interested in that. But as long as you've got $10 million of bankroll money in your campaign in one way or another through the PACs and whatnot, and you want to recognize Jerusalem, why not bomb Tehran too on behalf of Israel?
Let's moving on to Israel. The U.S. is planning to relocate the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. What do you think the impact would be on the move in terms of bringing peace to the region?
Does the opposite. We're seeing, what, the third or the fourth slaughter of the people of Gaza now. Yesterday it was 19 dead and 1,700 injured. I don't, we're dealing with some of the worst regimes in there. With Israel, they're an apartheid that should be treated like South Africa was treated. If we don't actually put boycotts in and sanctions and divestitures, we're not going to change the situation there. I'll leave it there.
You know, in the long run, I suppose that there's nothing wrong with having the embassy in Jerusalem, if that is indeed the capital of Israel. But the overall problem we have in the Middle East is that we don't treat the parties even-handedly. Israel, on a per capita basis, receives far more aid and assistance than any other country in the world from the United States. And what we really need to do is to begin to treat all of those countries more even-handedly. In the long run, I don't think this move of the embassy is going to be that big a deal.
Well, as with Putin and some others, a lot of these problems are rooted in their popular appeal with the populace, and this is one of them in the United States. I agree with the notion that we have certainly not contributed to the solution, and we may even have contributed to the problem over time. I see nothing that is likely to change that unless the American Jewish community breaks ranks with Netanyahu, which I don't see happening. So I think it is it's almost a lost cause.
Well, when I served in Jerusalem as a vice consul, second tour of duty, there was a book out at the time that was popular by a former consul general, Evan Wilson, and it was titled Jerusalem, Key to Peace. And with three great religions all claiming significant attachment to Jerusalem, you're not going to solve the Arab-Israeli problem without addressing Jerusalem. So on one level, it's silly to give away a major negotiating chip to the Israelis with nothing in return. But on another level, I'm not overly concerned about it for the reason that this is still open to negotiation. Whatever political move we've done, we can move our embassy again. It's still on the table for negotiation. And we're not going to make a deal unless the Palestinians get something related to Jerusalem and the Arabs. So in some ways, it's a symbolic gesture. I wrote an article for the Austin American Statesman where I said basically that Jerusalem, once again, I hate to keep bringing him up, was his Christmas gift to Sheldon Adelson, or Hanukkah gift to Sheldon Adelson. and so I think it's a nice gift, but it's meaningless because it's going to have to be taken away at some point.
Thank you. Okay, we're moving on to questions by the audience. We have some from Russia, China, Iran. Okay. I'm going to start with the cybercrime because we haven't talked about that at all. How does cybercrime affect diplomatic relations? A very good question because we're living in a different new age. You want me to repeat the question?
Well,
No,
It's just a really hard question.
it is.
You have the wrong person answering this. Eric is our cyber expert.
Sorry about that. Eric, do you want to answer that question? How does cyber?
Yeah, I don't see why not. Sure, go ahead.
Diplomatic
You know
relations.
that.
Eric is a cybercrime
Well,
specialist. So.
real quickly, one of the challenges with what we call cyber espionage, we'll look at it, is that it gives an asymmetry of power to smaller nations that don't have a large espionage or intelligence infrastructure, because you don't need a lot of spies in a huge infrastructure. You can have a few people who are very adept at using the computer that can find vulnerabilities within your critical infrastructure and penetrate those vulnerabilities to exfiltrate data and extract information. So it's actually a great leveler between countries. So you have small countries and mid-sized powers that are now operating almost at a peer level with major powers. For instance, Iran has a very well cyber espionage infrastructure, but we've had major hacking events that have attacked Western influence from North Korea, the big botnet system. So to cut to the chase on this, what it is it creates a leveling effect and an asymmetry of power that is going to give smaller countries an advantage, or to be able to deal with major countries. And that's going to change the strategic calculus for major countries.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to Gaza. We've discussed this a bit, but what should the U.S. do about Gaza right now? I think 17 people were killed 2 days ago, and there's still skirmishes going on.
But there's not skirmishes. You got to understand this. There are no weapons on the other side. The Palestinians were accused of having a slingshot, and unless there's Goliath on the other side, I don't see that as a problem. And shooting off fireworks. And on the other side, you got snipers with high-powered rifles shooting live ammo into a crowd of people. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. This shouldn't be allowed. The UN should stop it. It was despicable that the U.S. voted at the UN not to stop it.
No surprise.
Well, I don't think that the United States can stop it other than through some UN action. I certainly don't think the United States should be sending any forces over there to do anything. Once again, I think that in the long run, we're going to have to treat all of the parties in the Middle East more even-handedly. And that is, again, an issue that those people in the Middle East will be able to determine on their own if we would back off from our interventions.
Would y'all like to answer?
Well, I think on Gaza, you might want to shift the focus a little bit. For over a year now, we've been largely frittering away our level of respect and level of influence around the world. And so I think if the question is there anything we can do with Gaza? No, there really isn't. And I think the notion of using the UN would be the only way to do it. But would we do that when Israel is such an ally? So unfortunately, I think the tragedy of Gaza is going to continue.
I would make a distinction that there's a lot we could do, but we're not willing to.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. This question, I'm sorry I can't read the handwriting really well, but I'm going to try. Could Putin's interference become a precursor to invade Latvia? There's someone here concerned about Latvia.
I don't think Putin's worried about Latvia. You know, there are some really wonderful books that came out of the Brookings Institution a few years ago on Putin that describe him and tell you exactly how he thinks and how he acts. He's been in power ever since Yeltsin. Yeltsin we put in power. You know, we said the Spinmeisters over there for his election. The Communist Party would have won the election if it had not been the 3 Spinmeisters that we sent over there to put him in election. And he was horrible for Russia. Russia was nearly destroyed then. And we went in with our banks and our financial institute and pretty much raped that country. Then we left, and he appointed Putin, who was working for him, his staff, as his successor. And he was elected, and he's been elected ever since. The elections are paper ballots. They're in videotaped rooms. Everyone who watches these elections say they're good, and he gets a tremendous amount of votes. I don't understand what our problem is with Putin. Putin has become this demon, which he's not. If you take the time to read some of the books, you look at the interview that Oliver Stone did on 4 hours out of 30 hours of interviewing. You could look at the interviews he gives to on NBC to Kelly, Megyn Kelly. An hour and a half. He's patient. He discussed everything. Let me give you an example of what the 2 analysts that did the book on Putin for Brookings Institute say. Many in the West understand his willingness to fight. They misread his skill as a strategist, which he uses and turns into action. He knows very little about us. He makes good on every promise or threat. He's considered the CEO of Russia because he protects their assets. He does not micromanage, he monitors. This is Putin.
Are we demonizing Putin?
Well, certainly we are. I don't think he's a Boy Scout by any means, but...
Yeah, he was.
At one point.
Yeah.
But I think we do demonize him. As far as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia go, I would think that, from what I read, those countries are relatively prosperous these days, and it would not make any sense for Putin to invade them. That doesn't mean that they might not be worried about it, though.
Well, I think when it comes to Putin, I have a question that I can't answer about Putin. And one question is he Russian or is he Soviet? If he's Russian and trying to defend Russia, with all that psychology of the invasions from Napoleon, et cetera, and missiles in Turkey, and all those reasons why he might be concerned about having people who may not like him very much very close to his borders that would make him nervous, make any of us nervous. If that's Putin, then we ought to try to spend more time connecting with him. If what he's really after is rebuilding the Soviet Empire, which is what people talk about him wanting Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, is that he wants to take those back. They have a big Russian component. He has always used the notion of the Russian people. The defense of the Russian people is why he's in eastern Ukraine, why he's in Crimea, why he's got part of Moldova, and there are significant Russians in those three countries. Is he really more interested in expanding back the old empire? In that case, we've got to push back because there are people in his way who don't want to be in his way and don't want to be oppressed, and that's got to be fought. If he's really more concerned about Russia, then he needs to do things that signal to us that he's not concerned. Back his troops away from Latvia and Lithuania rather than having them right on the border, brigades right on the border. Why are we reinforcing Kaliningrad? If he's really more concerned about Russia, that's an outlying autonomous zone. So Putin needs to reveal to us which Putin we're dealing with, I think.
Well, until he does, I think we just have to judge his actions. I think the reason there are Russian troops in Georgia and not in Latvia is because Latvia is in NATO. I don't know if Putin is interested in Latvia, but the Latvians are very interested in Putin.
Yes, very good point. Okay, let's move on to Iran. If Trump cancels the Iran nuclear deal, would Iran be vulnerable? And how will Israel and Saudi Arabia react to this? Will they take advantage of it?
Well, I imagine they will take advantage of it if that occurs. It really doesn't make any sense to me for the deal to be canceled. The Iranian people, I believe, want to be our friends, and it's the problem is between our governments who can't seem to get along. The Iranian people, I don't see as a threat to us at all. And once again, I think we need to back off from our interventions in other countries, let them settle their differences. I mean, they've been over there for thousands of years, living together, fighting each other, and we've only been around for a couple of hundred years. Why is it that we think we know all of the answers?
I want to take it, or
I remember once being told that if every country in the Middle East were a true democracy, they would be far more anti-American than they are. And the country in which the population was the most pro-American was Iran. I think we have an extraordinary opportunity. We are shooting ourselves in the foot by continuing to not let, I mean, the reason they do this is to increase their own economic prosperity, and we continue to do things to keep that from happening. I think we are blowing that one, no pun intended, very badly.
okay. Do you think that Trump's actions during his presidency at the current pace will be enough to alienate and transform the U.S. from a world power to a world enemy?
He's done a good job of it so far. I can't see how he can do any worse. It's, well, he's got a new crew, so maybe he can do worse. I'm sorry, I'll take that one back. I'll leave it there.
I'll second that opinion.
I think it's very interesting that the dialogue around international affairs changed rather drastically when President Trump, by the way, the word president seems to have disappeared from our lexicon.
Yes.
I think that's too bad. Before a year and a half, most foreign affairs, foreign policy magazines, Princeton, et cetera, focused on the things that we've been talking about, Syria, Ukraine, China. Since then, the main issue has been whether or not the administration of President Trump will affect what is termed the liberal world order. The liberal world order is what we established in 1945-46 and have managed and to some extent paid for ever since. And it has three primary pillars. military alliances, the most important being NATO, but others in Japan and South Korea. Free trade, floating exchange rates, open investment borders, and a lean toward democratization, support of human rights, and advocacy for freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. During either the campaign or since, he has attacked all three of those pillars. So there is considerable concern that he will shake that order to the extent that it will not be put back together.
I think when it comes to Trump, is that our situation, America's situation, the United States, it's not so much that we will become the evil, hated. The thing that frightens me the most is that we're going to become irrelevant. The world is already, they're still doing climate. As soon as we dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that didn't take too long for those guys to redo it. They're going on without us. China's growing, Europe's growing, Africa's growing at 6%. What's going to happen is when these kids out here 20 years from now are CEOs of a company and they want to make a deal in Africa, how are they going to make a deal in Africa when we have this reputation of not sticking with our deals, but the Chinese do, and they pay big money? Jobs, over time, we will become, I hope, are there any French people here? We are about 50 years away from being the new France. And ex-power world leader that is irrelevant and makes nice cheese and wine.
But they have great bread and cheese. No, okay. Because of how interconnected the global economy is now, has the United States lost political leverage to hold countries like China accountable for human rights violations? Good question.
Would you repeat that?
Sure. Because of how interconnected the global economy is, how has the United States lost political leverage to hold countries like China accountable, for example, for human rights violations?
Well, I'll take that. How can we talk about their violations when we have more people in jail than the next three countries put together? We can't be throwing stones before we correct our own problems here. China is developing very quickly. They have some really wonderful ideas how they're going to expand into Europe through the Silk Road and the Belt, and they got a maritime system there. They're moving ahead. We're moving behind. We're nowhere in this economy. We don't have a plan. We don't have an idea. I don't know where we are, but we're nowhere near where the Chinese are.
I think that we're going to have to learn to lead by example, and that's something that we haven't been doing in our foreign affairs and often in our domestic affairs. And instead of trying to force people to do things at the point of a gun or sanctions or some kind of intimidation, we should just step back and take care of ourselves, lead by example, become relevant again, as Professor Sindelar is warning us about.
Yeah.
I believe the true source of American power is not our military or even our economy, it's our values. And every time we break our own values overseas by rigging an election or torturing someone, we lose power. I agree with what's been said. We can't stop being involved internationally in order to look at ourselves a little closer. But we do have to follow our own leadership, and then others will as well.
And I agree, values, if we need to return to our values a little more.
How would you answer the Russian claim that China is only exercising its right to self-determination?
China?
How would you answer the Russian claim that China is only exercising
You mean
its
Crimea?
right to self-determination?
Is it China or Crimea?
It's Crimea.
Is it Crimea? Yeah.
Oh.
Oh,
We were trying to understand, sorry.
okay. Now,
Thank you.
Crimea,
Thank you.
Crimea had a referendum, and it was a very well-done referendum, and the people there, which were mostly Russian, by the way, some Tatars and some Ukrainians, all voted, and I say all voted, and the vast majority of them, almost 90%, voted to be part of Russia. So you can't really say that they invaded the Crimea. He was very careful about going in there and making sure that he had everyone's agreement and approval to do it. He didn't want to lose that base. That base is too important to him. It's like our San Diego. You know, it's their naval base with Russian Navy and Russian naval families living there. So it wasn't going to be lost.
Well, historically, Crimea's moved back and forth, but it's largely been Russian for a long time.
1792.
Sometimes I think I believe in self-determination, but sometimes I think we have the idea that these lines that are on a map, that happen to be on the map right now, are the permanent map that should always be, and nothing is ever going to change. I don't know for sure whether a overwhelming majority of Crimeans prefer to be in Russia. Apparently, enough of them do that they are willingly staying in Russia.
I think probably he could have annexed Crimea legally. Crimea was part of Russia until 1954. He could have probably had an internationally recognized election and had a transition period, and he could have done it right. Instead, he did it his way, and that will never be accepted.
Basically the same thing. I think it's a two-sided coin. On one side, as people have said, it's mainly Russian, even though there might be a big Tatar presence. The charge of the Light Brigade was in the Crimea 150 years ago, so Russia's had it for a long, long time. But I don't think in the international legal community we should ever accept a military invasion as a way to get your way. So an election or a plebiscite, whatever, maybe, but to invade, I think basically what Putin needs to do now is give it back, and then we have a plebiscite, and then we'll decide. But he's got to actually show good faith first.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, as once diplomats or foreign affairs experts, what do you think the current administration is doing well? And what is it doing badly, very badly?
I'm sorry, I started focusing on well, and I got nowhere.
Speechless.
You know, his base would think that the tax increase was good, you know, but they haven't felt the effects of it yet. Except for the very wealthy, it's not good. It's going to come back and hurt them.
I'm sorry, let me clarify, it's for foreign policy.
Oh, for foreign policy?
Yeah, foreign policy.
Yeah.
What is he doing well in foreign policy, what is he doing bad? I know it's a very general question, but...
Badly is what he's doing with Mexico, what he's doing, what he's done with North Korea, the little rocket man, and he seemed to have gotten along well with the president of China, Xi, and that's probably one of the positive things I see. He does get along with Putin, which is good. But at the same time, he's taken actions that are anti-Russian. So I don't know. I think he's being driven by another part of his team, yeah.
This is an almost impossible question to answer because it seems to change from minute to minute, a sentence to sentence. I think most things he's not doing well in foreign policy. The only things that I think might be hopeful would be the possible opening to North Korea. I think it's very premature to try to say that that's being done well at this point, but I'm hopeful about it. That would be probably about the only thing I could think of.
I think there is a place in foreign policy for uncertainty. I think Ronald Reagan did that very well. North Korea is certainly an example. Perhaps, I mean, we'll see what happens with the tariffs in China and the real, I hope, effort. But you have to have some confidence that at least he has an objective in mind, and we don't. I think the worst thing he's done is divorce himself from the State Department. He has done really irreparable damage. And I don't know what Rex Tillerson's objectives were. They were not President Trump's, or he would still be there. Right. But I don't know what anyone has in mind for the carrying out of diplomacy.
What has Trump done good is the question. I'll pass it back to you,
Good.
Patricia. I'm going to say something, students, my class out there. Most, and I'll leave it to the Theodore Whites of the world and the presidential scholars, but generally those presidents who have come from our domestic side, and I would say Trump comes from our domestic side, as did President Obama, and even President Reagan really came from our domestic side. It takes them a while to get their feet on the ground in foreign policy. Now, I'm not really fond of much that Trump has done. He's got some intriguing things in play if he could do it in a less ham-handed way, some sort of tariffs that would be more directly protective of intellectual property, for instance, is a good thing. He has a positive view to go meet people. You can't do diplomacy unless you're shaking somebody's hand and talking to them face to face. And the State Department has often had this gamesmanship being more important than the meeting. Trump has jumped over that and said, I'll go meet Kim Jong-un. So there's intrigue that something might happen there. So he's got some intriguing irons in the fire. I don't know how it would come out. And most domestic presidents who start domestic take a couple of years to get there. So we may not know ultimately what he's capable of for another year or two. Maybe if he continues down this path, maybe not much. But if he's got some chess moves and some more openness in view, maybe. He's my president by minority vote. So I have to at least give him some slack to see what he can do in the next couple of years. Don't condemn him on the first year.
Sure. Let's talk about Europe. We haven't covered that, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. Populist politicians have come to power in Hungary, Viktor Orban in Poland, Andrzej Duda, Austria, Sebastian Kurz, and it appears that populists are set to form a government in Italy as right-wing and center-right parties swept the most recent elections. What impact does this rightward shift in European politics have for the U.S.?
Well, the reason for it, it was the neoliberal policies that came out of the United States and was adopted in Europe, where the banks got all the money and the people got very little. The other part of it was this mass immigration, which further stressed the situation over there, and that's why you see such a powerful, I call it almost fascist organizations growing throughout Europe. In Ukraine right now, you have neo-fascists running the military. It's the Bandar and some other groups that go back to Nazi influence are running it. Brexit was considered a right-wing action. The problem is, we got to get away from neoliberalism and neoconservatism in our foreign policy. We need to get back to a more equitable way of dealing with our people.
Populists throughout history don't appeal to our highest ideals. They generally appeal to some lower common denominator, and I think that generally they are not they're not bolstered by a great deal of insight or academic evidence. So I don't see, on the one hand, I'm happy to see people getting involved, getting upset, doing something. I wish they would educate themselves a bit better before they would go to vote, though. So I don't see the rise of populism as a totally positive thing.
I have a little trouble with the left-right definitions here. I think this is primarily an anti-refugee movement. I lived in Europe for 10 years, and the class system in Europe, in almost every country that I'm aware of, is just very different than it is here. There are, in some countries, more refugees than we have in the United, or people from elsewhere, but they never really assimilate. I think it's interesting that our invasion of Iraq caused the Arab Spring, which failed, which caused partially the disintegration of Syria, which caused the influx of refugees into Europe, which caused to a great extent Brexit and the other problems they're having.
Yes.
Question again?
Well, I think
Alzheimer's,
they answered basically the move to the right. in many
The
European
move
countries
to the
right
right, the national, I agree with most of what Kit said. I think, I wonder here how much, well, let me back up and say, the really virulent nationalism that became fascism existed basically just in Germany and Italy. I know there's Spain, you can throw in some other things, but it was relatively narrowly confined. Communism in its early phases was pretty narrowly confined to Russia. I think what we have now is the phenomenon of social media pumping up the action and making it seem a lot more. The quintessential example of that is the Arab Spring, and that eventually filtered back to the old style. When Emmanuel Macron is elected in France, and we all thought all of Italy was going hard nationalist, and it really did, and it kind of fractured into the usual Italian mess. I think it may be a shorter-lived phenomenon than you think, that is driven by short-term social media, but kind of like shining the light on the cockroaches. Here the cockroaches shine the light on themselves, and people begin to say, wait a second, this, and there's pushback. So I'm not overly concerned yet, because I think it's a phenomenon that will fade quicker than we think it will. Yeah.
All right, we have now time for questions from the audience. You can come up to the microphone.
Don't be shy. This is your big chance.
Your 15 seconds of fame.
No, we don't need that.
Don't fall down the steps.
I had a question about the North Korea situation. In particular, a non-nuclear peninsula has been thrown out as a term, and I'm wondering what the panel thinks about that notion. Is it a realistic goal? And if it is, what would you see as a method for verification on both sides? would an Iranian-style verification work where we're just sending in people to Iran to verify, or would they want to reciprocate and go inspect our submarines to make sure we're not nuclear either? Could you comment on a nuclear-free peninsula for Korea?
I guess I think the only way you're going to get a nuclear-free peninsula peaceably is for the Koreans to come to some type of reunification. Now, that wouldn't necessarily, in the short term, have to be a full reunification, but it would be at least a transitional phase. And I don't know how the North is going to assimilate, but that was a goal originally for each side. So as far as the nuclear aspect of it, I don't think that is that critical, because Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons, to what extent he may have them, are not very deliverable, and I don't see that that's going to change in the near future. So I'm not sure the nuclear part of it is the important part of it. I think it's the reunification of the Korean people.
Russia and China have a dog in this fight, too. They like the buffer zone that they have currently between the American military in South Korea and themselves, so that would make it a little more difficult. But I love the idea of reunification, and you know, if it could be the new Germany over there, that would be wonderful.
I don't see a structure for reunification that would be acceptable to both China and the United States. But what they may need to do is create a structure that is acceptable to neither. Clearly, there's a fear on the part of the North Koreans in terms of regime change. That fear comes primarily from South Korea, more than from us, and that would have to be alleviated to some extent. But I'm afraid that if the United States and China were major players in those discussions, it would just never happen.
Yeah, and I think on the unification question, if part of unification is the denuclearization of the peninsula, then we're in. I think that's good if unification can be achieved. I think, and I think Ambassador Ashby hit upon it by saying we may have to make a deal that neither side likes. If China can see that a change in that North Korean thorn in its side could come from unification, I think over time they could be brought into an agreement on a unification. I think our part in unification is something that America would have to gulp and think twice about, but I think we would have to maintain the defense agreement for the new Korea, but pull all our troops out, every last troop, close our bases and leave. Then the Chinese would have a buffer zone where we are not. They would also have a North Korea that would probably anytime soon be sending refugees across the border, would become less of a problem. North Korea would become South Korea's economic problem, and that gets back to the Germany thing, where East Germany took quite a while to get mixed in. Yeah. But I think a unified Korea is the answer, but you would have to convince the American generals and the Chinese politicians that the part of the deal they need to make.
I'm curious what the panel thinks of Saudi Arabia, what's going to happen with Saudi Arabia with the price of oil that stayed much lower than in the past, and the new Prince MBS, and you know how much they're basically, I guess, using their savings to pay for the people. And I'm just curious how you see the role of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East changing, and the war in Yemen.
Oh Lordy, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, this is a very interesting time. Maybe live in interesting times, whatever. The new crown prince, the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia now anyway, is doing a number of domestic programs that I would think that most people in the Arab world, much less us, would find as a positive and be very accepting of. He has this external foreign policy that is very thuggish and seems to be somehow maybe he's trying to rebuild some sort of caliphate or whatnot. He wants to be more influential, and he's going about it in a very ham-handed way on the foreign side of things. I guess if he could pull off the domestic side and tamp down his ardor on the foreign policy side, Saudi Arabia could grow from its fairly insular approach to policy in the past and become a major, I talk in my Middle East classes about it becoming the fourth pillar of the Middle East, which it is not now. The three pillars for centuries have been Iran, Plateau, Anatolian Plateau, or Egypt. Yeah. And Arabia has been basically a desert wasteland, but I think the price of oil will be supported enough that Saudi Arabia will have enough to continue to drive its economy. The question is what happens on the domestic front. And my one concern on the domestic front is this is looking an awful lot like what the Shah of Iran did when he modernized white revolution, cut the clerics out, changed the religious background, and before you knew, the pushback flipped because of the clerical side of it. The Wahhabi clerics are being fairly recalcitrant now, but will they keep that up as their power is winnowed away?
Right.
I just don't know. But he's going in a good direction domestically. I wish he'd calm down internationally.
I'm not an expert on Saudi Arabia, but it seems to me that they have an unsustainable model. And as countries begin to get on the downside of the trajectory, they become more bellicose, they become more frantic, and they become more unpredictable. And it seems to me that Saudi Arabia is entering into that.
I guess my main concern is that the United States is going hand in hand with Saudi Arabia. I think, once again, we need to pull back, let them determine their own fate, and not aid them in their international misdeeds, like in Yemen.
Yeah, I agree with the ambassador. I would love to see the Wahhabis reduced in power. They have all of the power in Saudi Arabia, and it's a pretty terrible situation. But right now, he's spending a lot of money maintaining forces fighting in Syria, and we're fighting in Iraq. And if there is a split with Iran, you're going to have a further split of the Middle East. You're going to have Iran, Syria, Lebanon, perhaps Russia lining up against Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the whole place will end up being like another Yemen. And we don't talk about Yemen enough. You know, there's 100,000 people with cholera down there. How do we stand for this? And we had a vote in Congress, and Congress didn't even vote to stop our military from interacting with Saudi Arabia. And there was a lot of Democrats that voted for that. What are we doing? What's wrong with us that we can't say no? We can't continue to bomb these people. It's a one-sided fish barrel shootout over there. We just drop bombs on the Yemenis, and the Yemenis have no way to fight back.
I'm curious what your thoughts are that the United States should do about these islands that China is putting in the South China Sea.
That's their Monroe Doctrine. That's exactly what they're doing. They're doing what we did. Central South America is our backyard. We have the Philippines, we have Puerto Rico, we had Cuba for a while. This is what they're doing. Is it a problem? I don't think so.
So I'm going to ask a question that's near and dear to my heart, and this is about the U.S. State Department and foreign diplomacy. So often they say that our foreign policy is a reflection of our domestic affairs as well as our domestic mentality, and I see that reflected in the nationalist movement across the world. We call it nationalist, some people call it a little bit different, right? So I wanted to ask, do you think that the U.S. needs to analyze the powers we're extending to the executive branch of the United States? Should we create foreign policy reform so that we have something more uniform, more stable, instead of depending on a personality to fulfill our agenda? Are we suffering the consequences of allowing a personality, depending on one person, to develop our agenda or how foreign policy is being basically handled for the U.S.? Also, I want you to answer this with thinking about how Xi Jinping has recently changed the constitution, and a lot of Chinese felt comfortable about that because he's been in power for so long that they feel comfortable with him. And I want you to think about this also considering that Putin is in power once again, and people who might not have even thought to participate in voting because they feel it's rigged are now voting for him because simply it's status quo and it's comfortable for them. They're afraid of having any kind of sudden shakeup or change or movement. So are we suffering because we have a system in which we're granting too much power to a personality or the executive branch instead of something more stable? I mean, look at what it's done to us this time around, right? So could you please answer that?
Thank you very much for that question. Would anybody like to take that? In other words, personality in the executive branch. We're depending too much maybe on the executive branch to make foreign policy decisions. I think that's what she's...
Well, absolutely. And that's what this resolution is all about, really, is that we've gone too far in the direction of the executive branch taking over. The legislative branch has passed the buck because either they don't know very much about foreign policy, or they are afraid to step forward, or they're just lazy and not willing to let the executive branch to put the executive branch in its place. That's really why we came up with this resolution, to try to reform U.S. foreign policy by going back to our traditional foreign policy and back to the concept of the three branches of government, each working in their own domain. Now, as far as the personalities about Putin and the Chinese president, I don't know about that. I think that there's a comfort that people do acquire in the same old person being in charge, and so that's a danger. In our case, we keep changing the person, but we're still letting the president run the show, and that's not the way the country was set up.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Good. I thought this was a better question for you.
I think it is the way the country was set up, and we're running into a situation of sort of legislative malfeasance. The country was set up under the Constitution so that Congress would exercise a reason. We said we want one person to be in charge of foreign policy and the military, and that's the president. But we also set up the courts and Congress to control that power, and it worked for a long, long time. It doesn't seem to be working anymore. Now, it's always hard to pass a law, that criminals will abide by. But and I don't have an answer on this, but it is a clear change from the way that we have managed up until now. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was president, 4 terms, 3.5. He was constant, and he got us in and out of World War II and the Depression, and he was constantly being controlled by Congress and constantly being controlled by the courts. That doesn't seem to happen anymore, and that's not the fault of the Constitution.
The textbook that I use for my foreign policy class talks specifically about the rise of the imperial presidency. And basically everything Ambassador Ashby said is correct. The Constitution itself is pretty solid in how the powers are split up. The president gets to command the troops and command foreign policy, but he can't do it until he gets some money from Congress. And the controls that have, over time, presidents have accreted to themselves this imperial situation where every agency you think of, whether it's defense, state, treasury, et cetera, if you really look at the structure of the White House, they have not those agencies, but there's some other head and organization within the White House structure itself that echoes that agency. The National Security Council is almost defense, CIA, and state all rolled into one, and the president doesn't have to leave the White House. So it's, to me, an increasingly dangerous situation to have an imperial presidency, but the problem is I can't answer that. That really is for the other 2 branches to answer that, and I think Ambassador Ashby's caught on to that, is that the voters of America have not asked the congressman to take that action, basically. So until votes change and we put people in Congress that are willing to balance that back out again, I don't think we're going to go we'll always have an imperial presidency, and it doesn't take too long for anybody who becomes president to realize it's kind of fun to be in charge of all these troops and stuff like that. So it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or Green who's the president, they're all going to love it.
I want to go back to what the ambassador said about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was voted in 4 times. And I ask you, what's wrong with that? As long as we're voting, what's wrong with the president being in there for a long time? Unless he becomes the leader of the empire, of course that becomes a problem. But generally, it shouldn't be a problem as long as the people are voting for them.
You're not permitted.
This is a ringer. Okay, so there was a couple of responses, and I'd like to put it in a different context. One had to do with the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, likening it in some way to the Monroe Doctrine, and the other had to do with the whole question of the Crimea. And I think there was a question from one of the audience members about Crimea. In both cases, none of the respondents to that question mentioned the international laws, norms, and conventions that were in place that all parties were signatory to, that could have been used because they had an arbitration or a mediation component. With respect to Crimea, there's the OSCE, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. 53 countries are signatory, including the United States. That treaty that Russia signed and Ukraine signed said that borders were inviolable. There's an arbitration clause that said that if Russia wanted to bring a case about some sort of abuse of Russian-speaking people in the Crimea, there's an arbitration. They should have presented their case to that panel for arbitration. It could have included self-determination voting and all that, but the OSCE would have to mandate it and establish monitors so that those elections would be free and fair. Didn't happen. In the case of China, in the South China Sea, there's the International Convention on the Laws of the Sea Treaty. The Philippines actually brought a case. And the Chief Justice of the Philippine Court went to arbitration with his team. They won their arbitration against China. China decided it did not want to defend itself in court, even though it was signatory to the treaty. So the point of asking the question the way I did is that we seem to forget that there's a vast architecture of international law and convention that's supposed to govern the way nations behave with one another, that seems to be, that architecture seems to be falling apart. And the United States is just as guilty as anyone else with these drone strikes where we're violating airspace, and we don't even have an authorization for the use of military force. And the president has, in many ways, has delegated responsibility for military action to the regional commanders, the CENTCOM and the CINCPAC and all that. So I guess this is a long-winded way of asking a question. Are you confident that there is a way, or we can maintain any sort of international legal architecture that will respect or in any way govern the relations between states? Or is that just a bygone era? And we're basically in a new frontier, speaking to the ambassadors, a comment about having built the liberal architecture, post-World War II relationships. Is that gone? And if it is gone, where do we go from here?
Well, Eric, you know far more about this than I do. And I fear that it's probably gone. I don't know, I mean, what do you do if nobody brings it up? And what do you do if the power ignores the arbitration? I fear that it's gone.
When we have such a history of manifest destiny, you can't tell China you can't put that island there. You know, it's so I don't think you have that argument.
Well, you do have the argument in that it's against international law. The question is, does anybody care?
Yeah, I think
Right,
that's
right.
exactly it.
Because
And
everyone's breaking.
what I didn't mention, that one of the pillars of the liberal world order was international institutions. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the UN were all created as part of this system. And the United States, being the strongest power, said, we will abide by all of these, the decisions of all of these institutions. You may remember the contract with America under Newt Gingrich. One part of it was basically not paying attention to the UN. And I was interested in that because I was at the UN at the time, and
A little concerned.
all of the surveys that we saw showed that a significant preponderance of American people favored the UN and had faith in the UN. But I asked someone about that, and they said, people who like the UN will not change their vote because you like it. People who don't like the UN will change their vote because you like it. The UN and these other institutions have been whittled away in the, in the trial of public opinion through several presidents now. And it would be very difficult for us at this time to say, okay, now these things matter.
I need Christian and Emily to answer that question from international law. What's the answer, guys? Actually, I'm going to be the optimistic soul here. We had virtually little, if any, international law to speak of at all 500 years ago. And what little international law we had 500 years ago was mercantile law put together by Belgian and Italian city-states and maritime law. What do you do when my goods get swamped by a storm in the Mediterranean? That evolved over time, and we started making more and more these little bilateral agreements became multinational treaties. And I think what the best thing, what is happening is when we were all out there with Lucy in Africa, we didn't have any constitutions. We had to develop that over time. International law is in an early developmental stage, but generally it's working. We are coming up with more and more treaties that more and more nations pay attention to and generally abide by. The textbook we use in international law talks about the stoplight theory. There's no cop there telling you whether, usually, that you can go or not go through the stoplight. But because it's there, because that is the social norm accepted by most people, most of us will stop at a stoplight. Sure, there are people who violate it for their own selfish reasons and go on through the red light, but most people abide by the stoplight. And I think if you took all the events in commerce, border issues, foreign policy issues, and you put them in a pot and said we had 10,000 of these this year, 999,000 of them, more or less, would have been solved through an application of an international treaty. What happens is you get the outliers on their one specific issue who are just bound and determined to do it different, like the Chinese over the South China Sea and Russia over Crimea. And in both cases, what they're doing with those claims is international law has always recognized historical claims as if they predate something new, there's weight for those historical claims. You may not win or lose, but anyway, I'm optimistic. The international legal system works 98% of the time, which is a lot more than it did under the kings and queens 200 years ago.
I would only point out that there has not been a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate since Reagan.
Yes, yeah. That's we're not playing in the game. Yeah.
So we have time for closing remarks, and I'd like to end it on a positive note. So, it's been pretty depressing. So each one of you share with us if you're hopeful about something with regards to foreign policy.
Well,
Regards to foreign policy.
I grew up in the Cold War era where, as the nuns would tell us, we're having a drill, you got to get underneath the desk, put your head down between your legs and your hands on your head so you're protected for that atom bomb exploding. And I never really felt I felt safe in that situation. I never liked the position. I don't want another Cold War. I really don't think we have to have one, and I think it's only because we want to sell armaments that we have it. And we need to stop. We need to actually take that budget and half it and start using it internally for our infrastructure, use it for creating more equality, do all the things that we should be doing, that people will want to follow us after we do them, and not continue this adding more money and more money to the military budget.
You know, after I graduated from University of St. Thomas, I learned about a new political party called the Libertarian Party, and I became very enthused about that. And I ran for office a number of times. And I think that if most Americans had voted as I've voted for the last few decades, we wouldn't have all of these international problems. We wouldn't have all of these domestic problems. But that's beside the point. I've become very discouraged many times over the years. And the only reason I'm here right now is because I became a little more encouraged recently, that is in the last couple of years, when I came across the Foreign Policy Alliance. And so I have a little hope that the approach that the Foreign Policy Alliance is trying to use is to try to develop a coalition of liberals and conservatives and Republicans and Democrats, independents, Greens, libertarians, who can work across the political spectrum, because none of us, obviously, not even the Republicans or the Democrats, can do it alone. So that's why I'm working with the Foreign Policy Alliance. And I hope you will pick up one of our brochures. And it has our resolution inside it and a little bit of a description. And I'd like to ask you to endorse our resolution and write your senators and your congressmen and ask them to endorse the resolution. And then, and most importantly, ultimately, take a look at the back page. We have some endorsements from a number of academics who've written extensively on foreign policy. And I think that the real key to success in the long run, and I see this as a long-run project, is that we have to educate ourselves more about foreign policy rather than passing the buck as the Congress has been doing all these years. So what I would recommend is, if you want to be hopeful, as I am hopeful right now, is that you look over some of these academics and pick up one of their books or look them up on Google and read one of their articles or watch one of their YouTube videos. Some of those articles are quite brief, and gosh, if you did that once a month or maybe read one book a year, I mean, by the end of the year, you would be
Smarter.
You'd be smarter than 95% of the American people on foreign policy. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador.
I'm old enough to have seen more than one bad president, and we've survived them all. And we'll survive the rest.
Tourette's.
Not to mention names.
Tourette's.
And this will not be the last, if you think this one. And by the way, as a domestic aside, you know, I used to have a boss who said, people are neither knaves nor fools. They don't do what they do because they're bad or evil, and they don't do what they do because they're stupid. They do what they do because it looks reasonable from their point of view. And I think the people who were damaged by globalization and who nobody cared or noticed made a very rational decision to vote for President Trump. Where that will lead us, we have to see. But I have faith that the American people eventually get it. They always have. We always have. I see nothing that muddies that perception. Looking at local elections coming around, they've made some pretty wise choices. So, you know, there are impediments, money and the fact that what a politician wants more than anything else is to be reelected. But I'm not yet convinced that the system is so broken that no good will come of it.
I would second that thought and take it international. We have, as a mankind, a global mankind, we have survived a lot of bad periods and bad leaders, whether it's Stalin or Mao, Hitler, etc. They come and they go. There will be some more bad leaders we'll have to deal with, but I think what we need to, around the world, but what we need to look at is that generally, if you look at the Freedom House maps about democracy, democracy is strong in 80 countries plus, capitalism is strong. The Chinese may have a new constitutional segment on Xi Jinping thought, but they're very capitalist in the way they do business, so they're major elements of that liberal democratic order, that liberal world order that is out there that is working. Africa has an economic growth rate regionally of 6 or 7%, which is almost what China is. The boats are generally floating upward, and these aberrations that come along from time to time will be survived. And I still think your world will be better in 50 years than my world was when we were fighting the Cold War.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Kip.